Imagine a negotiation table stretching from Washington to New Delhi, piled high not just with papers and coffee cups, but with the weight of history, economics, and geopolitics. Today we are talking about India and the United States, two of the world's largest democracies. Its trade relationship has been a roller coaster ride of tariffs, technology, and now oil politics. What is happening behind those closed doors? Why are trade talks suddenly turning positive? And how do Russian oil and tariff disputes shape the story? Let us dive deep into the complexity, because this is not just about trade. It is about how India positions itself in a world where every economic choice is also a strategic signal. For years, India and the US have had a strange trade relationship. On one hand, they are natural partners, both democracies, both huge markets, both needing each other's goods and services. On the other hand, they have bickered constantly over tariffs, intellectual property, agricultural subsidies, digital taxes, and the balance of trade. It has been a relationship of attraction and irritation, of cooperation mixed with disputes. Each time the two sides get close to a breakthrough, something comes in the way: steel tariffs, data privacy laws, farm imports, or visas for Indian tech workers. So why are we saying now that the trade talks are turning positive? The answer lies partly in the shadow of Russia. After Moscow's invasion of Ukraine, Washington expected New Delhi to align with Western sanctions. But India, thinking first of its own energy security, increased purchases of discounted Russian oil. This created friction. American lawmakers questioned why a partner buying billions worth of defense equipment from the US was also funneling billions to Russia's economy through crude oil imports. Editorials warned that India was playing a dangerous game. At one point, there were even whispers that India might face secondary sanctions if it crossed certain red lines. And yet, here we are today with trade talks showing a friendlier, more constructive tone. What changed? What changed is that both sides realized they need each other more than they need to argue. For the US, India is the key to balancing China in Asia. Washington cannot afford to alienate New Delhi at a time when Beijing is growing more assertive. In the South China Sea, on the Taiwan question, and along the Himalayan border. For India, the US remains the most important source of high-technology, advanced defense platforms, and investment capital. To walk away from that relationship would mean slowing down India's growth story. So trade talks had to find a new path. The Russia oil issue, instead of breaking the relationship, became a test of resilience. Let's talk about the Russian oil angle in detail, because that is where the real drama lies. When Western sanctions came into force, Russian crude suddenly became available at huge discounts. Sometimes $20 to $30 cheaper per barrel compared to Brent. For a country like India that imports over 85% of its oil, this was an irresistible offer. The Indian government argued openly. Our duty is to our citizens, to keep fuel prices stable, to protect households from inflation, to keep our factories running. The US initially pressed hard. Senior officials flew to Delhi, urging India to reduce purchases. But when it became clear that India was not backing down, Washington quietly recalibrated. Better to let India keep buying, they reasoned, than to push it into Moscow's arms. Instead, they shifted the conversation from criticism to coordination. They asked India to avoid transactions in dollars with sanctioned banks, to keep purchases under the price cap, and to stay transparent. India listened, nodded, and continued buying. The anger softened into acceptance. Meanwhile, trade negotiators used the easing of tensions to revive long-stalled talks. Suddenly, there was progress on long-standing disputes. Washington hinted it might roll back some steel and aluminum tariffs imposed during the Trump era. India signaled flexibility on reducing duties for certain American agricultural goods. Talks began on digital trade rules, where India had previously resisted US pressure. Even visas for Indian professionals came back into the discussion, a key issue for India's $200 billion IT services industry. Piece by piece, the table that had been cluttered with disputes began to clear. Now, you may ask, why are tariffs so central in this story? Because tariffs are symbols of trust or the lack of it. When the U.S. slapped high tariffs on Indian steel and aluminum, India responded with tariffs on American apples, almonds, and walnuts. It became a trade tit-for-tat that poisoned goodwill. Consumers suffered, businesses grumbled, and politicians scored points. To end that cycle means more than just reducing costs of goods. It means restoring faith that each side is willing to compromise. And that is exactly what the current trade talks are trying to achieve. But beyond tariffs and oil, let us not forget the bigger picture. The strategic alignment between India and the U.S. Trade cannot be separated from geopolitics. Every concession, every agreement, every handshake at the negotiating table is also a message to Beijing, to Moscow, and to the world. When India and the U.S. improve trade relations, they also deepen their strategic partnership. It makes joint military exercises smoother, defense procurement easier, technology sharing more likely. In other words, it ties the two democracies closer, not just in economics, but in security. The skeptics will say, hold on, isn't this just temporary? What if oil prices fall? What if the U.S. gets tired of India's independent foreign policy? What if another dispute flares up tomorrow? All valid questions. But remember this, trade relations between big powers are rarely about permanent solutions. They are about managing differences, creating space to work together despite disagreements. The fact that India and the U.S. are turning a corner after the Russia oil episode proves that they have the maturity to manage such differences. That is itself a victory. Let us also consider the domestic angle. For Prime Minister Modi, a positive trade story with the U.S. plays well at home. It shows that India is respected, that it can stand firm on Russia, while still gaining concessions from Washington. For President Biden, smoothing trade with India demonstrates his Indo-Pacific strategy is working, that he is building alliances not just with Europe, but also with Asia's rising powers. Each leader gains politically, and that political incentive adds momentum to the talks. Of course, challenges remain. Intellectual property rights, e-commerce rules, labor standards, climate-linked tariffs all are contentious issues. India wants to protect its small farmers and small businesses. The U.S. wants to open markets for its giants in agriculture and technology. These differences will not vanish overnight. But what matters is the direction of travel. For the first time in years, that direction is forward, not backward. Think of it this way. The Russia oil tension was like a storm cloud that threatened to break the umbrella of India-U.S. trade. But instead of letting the umbrella collapse, both sides held it tighter, adjusted their grip, and walked together. The storm is not gone, but the umbrella is stronger. That is the lesson of today's trade talks. In the long term, energy will remain at the heart of this relationship. As India seeks to diversify away from fossil fuels into renewables, it will look to the U.S. for clean technology, for climate financing, for innovation in green hydrogen and solar. As the U.S. looks to diversify supply chains away from China, it will look to India as a partner in manufacturing, in pharmaceuticals, in semiconductors. Oil may have triggered the latest round of adjustments, but the road ahead is about much more. So, where does this leave us? We are at a fascinating moment where economics, politics, and strategy converge. Sanctioned Russian oil was supposed to divide India and the U.S. Instead, it pushed them to redefine their trade partnership. Tariffs, once a symbol of hostility, are now on the table for reduction. Technology and energy are emerging as areas of cooperation. And both sides are learning that their differences are not obstacles, but bargaining chips in a relationship too important to fail. As I conclude this deep dive, I want you to picture two negotiators shaking hands at the end of a long day. They may not have solved every dispute, they may not trust each other completely, but they know they cannot walk away. That handshake, imperfect but firm, is what India's trade talks represent today. They are turning positive not because the problems are gone, but because the partners are stronger. And under the pressure of Russian oil and tariff disputes, they have found a new rhythm, one that may well define the geopolitics of the coming decade.